The abduction was, in Alistair's not inconsiderable opinion, a masterpiece of theatrical intimidation. He had arranged for a moonless night, the kind that swallowed light and sound. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and coming rain, was his to command. He had manifested from shadow in the ostentatious, topiary-choked garden of Hugo Vance's country estate, a whisper of velvet and cold fury. The woman, Clara, had been standing by a ludicrously ornate fountain, a sliver of champagne flute in her hand, her expression one of polite, soul-crushing boredom. Alistair had allowed the merest flicker of his true nature to show, the elongation of shadow, the bleed of red in his eyes, the profound, preternatural silence that heralded his presence. He had savored the expected cascade of emotions, the initial, prickling awareness of a predator, the sharp intake of breath, the widening of the eyes, the drop of the glass, the scream. Oh, the scream. He had anticipated a particularly satisfying one, a proper, lung-shredding shriek that would echo across the manicured lawns and serve as a perfect, visceral message to his insufferable rival. Hugo Vance, with his smug corporate takeovers and his bloodline so thin it was practically water, had encroached upon Alistair's territory one too many times. This kidnapping was not about the woman. It was about principle. It was a statement. He stepped fully from the shadows, a tall, imposing figure in a coat the color of dried blood. He let the silence stretch, a painter admiring his canvas before the first, violent stroke. Clara turned. She blinked. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of hazel, registered his presence. She did not drop her glass. She did not scream. She sighed. It was not a sigh of fear. It was a sigh of profound, bone-deep relief. The kind of sigh one emits after finally taking off shoes that have been pinching for 8 hours. "Oh, thank God," she said, her voice a low, melodious murmur. Alistair froze. His entire meticulously crafted overture of terror screeched to a halt. He had been planning his opening line for the better part of a week, something grand, something chilling. "You have been chosen, mortal, to pay the price for another's arrogance." It had gravitas. It had menace. He did not get to say it. "You have no idea," she continued, taking a small, grateful sip of her champagne. "He was making me approve canapé menus." Menus. Plural. Apparently, there's a debate raging in the kitchen over the structural integrity of the mini quiche. "I was about 5 minutes away from throwing myself into that fountain." She gestured with her flute toward the cherub spitting water. "So, whoever you are, whatever this is, thank you. You've saved me from a fate worse than death," a discussion about smoked salmon vol au vents. Alistair just stood there. For the first time in perhaps 700 years, he was utterly, completely, and profoundly baffled. His mind, a vast and ancient repository of strategy, seduction, and slaughter, came up with precisely nothing. The cogs of his immortal brain, usually spinning with predatory grace, had jammed. Did she thank him for abducting her? He had to recalibrate. This was a ploy, a strange, modern form of defiance. She was trying to unbalance him. Clever. Futile, but clever. He would reassert control. "You do not understand the gravity of your situation," he finally managed, his voice a low growl that had sent armies fleeing. She looked him up and down, a slow, appraising glance that was far more unnerving than any scream. "Okay, let's see. Tall, dark, ridiculously handsome in a brooding Byronic hero sort of way. Dressed like you're the lead in a very expensive Gothic rock opera. You appeared out of thin air, and the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. I'm going to go with vampire. Am I warm?" The casual accuracy was, frankly, insulting. He was Alistair, the Night King of the Crimson Court, scourge of the Carpathian vein, the last of the old blood. He was not a type. "Your flippancy will not serve you," he bit out, the words colder than a tombstone. He gestured, and the shadows around them deepened, coalescing, tendrils of darkness wrapping around her ankles. It was a classic. A crowd pleaser. Clara looked down at the writhing blackness coiling around her calves. She wiggled her toes in her wholly impractical heels. "Ooh, spooky. Is this the part where you whisk me away to your dark, foreboding castle?" "Silence," he commanded, the word imbued with the weight of ages. Just asking for logistical purposes, she said, completely unperturbed. Should I have brought a coat? I didn't bring a coat. Hugo said the weather would be mild, but Hugo also thinks artisanal toast is a personality trait, so his judgment is questionable at best. The shadows dissipated. Not because he dismissed them, but because Alistair was so distracted by the sheer, magnificent absurdity of the conversation that he simply forgot to maintain the spell. He had terrified popes. He had brought empires to their knees. He had never, in his long and storied existence, been derailed by a commentary on toast. "You are my prisoner," he stated, trying to inject the words with the finality of a death sentence. Clara's eyes lit up with something that looked alarmingly like genuine hope. "Wonderful. Does prisoner status get me out of my bridal shower?" She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping. "Because Janine from Hugo's marketing department is organizing it, and she has an unhealthy obsession with games involving toilet paper. This could be a real win-win." Alistair stared at her. The scent of her blood was intoxicating, a symphony of life and warmth that usually sent him into a state of focused, predatory desire. Now, it was just a background note to the blaring cacophony of his own confusion. He had kidnapped a living, breathing paradox. He had expected screams. He had received a social calendar complaint. "Come," he said, the single word clipped and harsh. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a response. He would simply take her. He reached out, his fingers like steel bands, to grip her arm. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She placed her empty champagne flute neatly on the stone rim of the fountain. "All right, but if we're going, let's go. Another minute here and his mother is going to corner me to show me swatches for the reception hall upholstery. They're all beige. Every single 1 inch." He wrapped his arm around her waist, the fabric of her dress cool beneath his palm. He prepared for the disorienting, gut-wrenching sensation of shadow walking, a method of travel that left most mortals vomiting for an hour. He braced himself for her panicked cry. Finally, she breathed, resting her head against his shoulder as if he were a taxi she had been waiting for in the rain. Action. In a swirl of night and cold wind, they vanished from the garden, leaving behind only an empty glass and the faint, lingering scent of champagne and disbelief. The arrival was as jarring as the departure. They materialized not in a damp, dripping dungeon, but in the center of Alistair's personal study. It was a vast, circular room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a fire roaring in a hearth large enough to roast a bull, and a massive obsidian desk polished to a mirror sheen. It was a room designed to broadcast power, intellect, and ancient wealth. Clara stumbled slightly, but caught her balance with a dancer's grace. She didn't look sick. She didn't even look particularly dizzy. She looked around, her head tilted, an expression of critical assessment on her face. She said. Alistair released her, stepping back. He needed space. He needed to think. His entire plan had been predicated on terror, on breaking Hugo's prized possession. But the possession seemed entirely unfazed. In fact, she seemed to be redecorating his castle in her head. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" she mused, gesturing to the room at large. "The whole Gothic overlord aesthetic. Very dramatic. But the lighting is terrible for reading. And all this dark wood just swallows the light. You could really open the place up with a lighter paint color. A nice greige, maybe. And some task lighting." "This is not a home renovation consultation," Alistair snarled, his patience, a famously long and durable thing, fraying like cheap string. "This is your prison." Right. Prison. Got it." She walked over to his bookshelves, running a finger along the spines of ancient, leather-bound tomes. "Wow. First editions. Is this a complete collection of pre-schism theological texts?" Hugo's idea of a library is 3 shelves of ghostwritten business memoirs and a signed copy of The Art of the Deal. She paused, pulling out a heavy volume. "Good heavens. Is this the original Codex Umbra? I wrote my graduate thesis on this. Or, well, on the parts that aren't supposedly lost to history. I guess they weren't so lost after all." She was treating his collection of forbidden, soul-shattering grimoires like a quaint neighborhood book exchange. Alistair strode over and snatched the book from her hands, the air crackling with his fury. "You will not touch these. They contain knowledge that would shatter your fragile mortal mind." "Fragile?" She raised an eyebrow. "I've sat through a 4-hour board meeting on quarterly earnings projections where the only visual aid was a pie chart that was clearly just a repurposed pizza delivery coupon. My mind is a fortress." He placed the book back on its shelf with reverential care. He was losing control, and he knew it. He was the one on the back foot. He, Alistair, the king. It was galling. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone shifting from art critic to business negotiator. It was a tone he recognized. It was the tone Hugo used. He hated it. "I want your fiancé to suffer," he said, turning to face her, letting the full force of his ancient rage color his words. "I want him to know that what is his can be taken. That his little empire of glass and steel is built on sand, and that I am the tide." It was a good line. Poetic. Menacing. He was proud of it. Clara considered this for a moment. "Okay. I can see that. He is intensely possessive. But you've made a slight tactical error." "I do not make errors." "You do," she insisted calmly. "You've assumed I'm something he values." Alistair blinked. "He is to marry you. Your union solidifies the merger of two of the largest family fortunes on the continent. You are not some bauble, you are the linchpin of his grandest acquisition." He had done his research. He knew the intricate details of the Vance-Cresswell merger. "Exactly," Clara said, a sad, knowing little smile touching her lips. "I'm the linchpin. An asset. A line item in a contract. He doesn't value me. He values the deal. He's not going to be heartbroken. He's going to be litigious. You haven't inspired terror, you've inspired a strongly worded letter from his legal team." Alistair felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. It was not anger. It was pity, a ridiculous notion. He did not pity mortals. They were ephemeral, like butterflies. One did not pity a butterfly for its short lifespan. "He will come for you," Alistair said, though the conviction in his own voice was beginning to wane. "Oh, he'll come for me," she agreed. "But he won't come with a flaming sword. He'll come with a subpoena. He'll try to sue you for property damage and unlawful detainment. He'll probably try to write off the entire rescue mission as a business expense." The sheer, soul-crushing banality of her prediction was more chilling than any curse in his ancient books. He had orchestrated a grand, Gothic drama, and she was telling him it was about to devolve into a small claims court dispute. "Now," she said, clapping her hands together with a brisk efficiency that was deeply alarming. "About this whole prisoner situation. What are the amenities? Is there a gym? And more importantly, what's the Wi-Fi password? I have a feeling I'm going to have a lot of free time, and I'm halfway through a fascinating documentary on the history of concrete." Alistair, Lord of the Night, Master of the Undead, simply stared at the woman who was more concerned about internet access than her immortal soul. He had wanted to spite his rival. He had a sinking feeling he had just acquired a roommate. A very, very strange roommate. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though Alistair was beginning to suspect he was the one being psychologically warred upon. He had shown her to a guest chamber. A magnificent one, of course. He was a king, not a barbarian. The room was larger than her entire apartment in the city, with a vast, curtained bed, a fireplace of its own, and a balcony overlooking a chasm so deep that its bottom was perpetually lost in shadow. It was meant to be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. A gilded cage. Excellent, Clara had declared upon seeing it. Great natural light in the morning, I assume? And the acoustics in here are fantastic. You can really hear the eternal screaming of the damned, is it? Or is that just the wind? Either way, it's got character. He had left her there, locking the heavy oak door with a resounding, final-sounding thud. He had expected, perhaps, some belated tears. Some rattling of the handle. Instead, he heard, very faintly through the thick wood, a contented hum. He spent the night brooding. It was one of his primary occupations, and he was exceptionally good at it. He sat in his throne room, a cavernous hall of black marble and silver inlay, and contemplated the infuriating woman upstairs. He tried to focus on Hugo. On the rage and panic his rival must be feeling. But the image kept being replaced by Clara's wry smile and her clinical assessment of his decor. He had sent for food to be delivered to her room. A lavish spread, of course. Roasted fowl, fruits that glittered like jewels, bread still warm from his spectral kitchens. It was a display of power. See what your captor provides. Be grateful. Be afraid. A few hours later, the tray was returned, untouched, with a note. The note, written in a neat, elegant script on the back of a napkin, read, "Lovely presentation, but a bit heavy for a first meal in a new place. Do you have any yogurt? Or perhaps some granola? Also, the pomegranate seeds are a choking hazard. Just some friendly feedback." Alistair had crumpled the napkin in his fist so tightly that it could have turned to diamond. Granola. She was his prisoner, a pawn in a game of ancient powers, and she was requesting granola. He found himself pacing his study, a habit he hadn't indulged in for centuries. He felt restless, unsettled. He was used to a predictable world. Mortals were fragile, fearful, and easily manipulated. They were the strings on his violin, and he was the master musician. Clara was not a string. She was a wrench, thrown directly into the delicate inner workings of his instrument. He decided to confront her. He needed to re-establish the dynamic. He was the monster. She was the victim. He swept into her room without knocking, a whirlwind of dark silk and cold authority. "Your continued insolence tries my patience," he began, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged chamber. Clara was not cowering by the fire. She was not weeping into her pillows. She was on the balcony, leaning against the cold stone railing, looking out at the jagged peaks of his domain under the pale moonlight. She was wearing a silk robe she must have found in the wardrobe, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked serene. "Oh, hello," she said, turning. "I was just admiring the view. It's spectacular. Very end of the world, but in a scenic way. You know, I think a small bistro table and 2 chairs would be perfect out here. For morning coffee." "There will be no morning coffee," he thundered. "There will be terror. There will be despair." "Is that before or after the granola?" she asked, her expression perfectly serious. "I'm just trying to get a sense of the schedule." Alistair felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. "You think this is a game?" "No," she said, and for the first time, her voice lost its light, ironic edge. It was softer. Quieter. "I think this is a temporary and rather theatrical reprieve from a life I didn't choose, in which I was about to legally bind myself to a man who alphabetizes his sock drawer." She looked back out at the chasm. "You think your castle is a prison? Try attending 3 separate charity galas in 1 week, each one with the same people, the same food, and the same stifling conversations about stock options and summering in the Hamptons. Try having your entire future mapped out for you like a corporate merger. That is a prison, Your Highness. This," she gestured to the Gothic splendor around them, "is just a vacation with a more dramatic theme." He was silent. Her words landed not like a joke, but like a stone dropped into a deep well. He had seen her life from the outside, the wealth, the privilege, the handsome fiancé. He had seen it as something to be envied, and therefore, something to be broken. He had never considered that the cage was already built, and he had simply relocated the bird. The thought was disquieting. It complicated his neat narrative of vengeance. "Hugo Vance is considered one of the most eligible men in the world," he stated, a fact he had gleaned from the vapid society pages he'd had his minions procure. "His eligible in the same way a particularly well-funded spreadsheet is eligible," Clara retorted. "His stable. His predictable. Our marriage is synergistic. It's not a romance, it's a transaction. I'm trading my name for his portfolio. My parents are thrilled. His are ecstatic. Everyone gets what they want. And what do you want?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. It was a personal question. An intimate one. He did not ask mortals intimate questions unless it was part of a seduction. This was not a seduction. This was an interrogation that had gone wildly off script. Clara turned to face him fully, the moonlight catching in her eyes. I wanted to finish my thesis. I wanted to teach. I wanted to spend a Saturday in a dusty library without having to check my phone for texts about which floral arrangement is less funereal for the wedding brunch. A small, bitter smile played on her lips. I wanted a life that was mine. But the world I was born into doesn't have much use for that. There it was again. That strange, uncomfortable flicker of empathy. He, an eternal king bound by tradition and reputation, and she, a mortal woman bound by family and finance. The shape of their cages was different, but the bars felt suddenly, unnervingly similar. My library is extensive, he found himself saying, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. You are welcome to it. Clara's eyes widened slightly. The mask of wry detachment slipped, and for a second, he saw the hopeful scholar she'd mentioned. Really? I am a king, he said, drawing himself up, trying to reclaim some of his lost dignity. I am not a barbarian. Of course my prisoner may have access to reading materials. It was a ridiculous justification, and they both knew it. Thank you, she said, and the words were simple, sincere, and utterly disarming. He needed to leave. The air in the room had changed. It was no longer a prison cell. It felt shared. He turned on his heel, his cloak swirling around him with practiced drama. Just one more thing, she called after him as he reached the door. He paused, his hand on the iron handle, and looked back over his shoulder. What? The Wi-Fi password? Alistair gritted his teeth. He considered telling her that his ancient, cursed castle did not possess such modern trivialities. But he was, for all his brooding, a creature of comfort himself. Of course he had Wi-Fi. How else was he to keep track of his vast, global financial holdings and stream high-definition nature documentaries about deep-sea predators? Blood Sovereign 1066, he muttered, the words tasting like ash and humiliation in his mouth. The B and S are capitalized. He swept out of the room, slamming the door behind him. He did not hear a hum of contentment this time. He heard a small, triumphant laugh. And for some reason, the sound did not enrage him. It made the corners of his own mouth twitch in a way they hadn't for a very, very long time. The days that followed settled into a bizarre rhythm, a domesticity that Alistair found both infuriating and strangely compelling. He was a creature of habit, but his habits had been fixed for centuries: brooding, ruling, hunting, the occasional strategic massacre. Now, his habits included Clara. She treated his terrifying, labyrinthine castle like a slightly dilapidated country house she was considering purchasing. She explored. She would pop up in the most unexpected places. He found her one afternoon in the Grand Armory, tapping a gauntlet with a manicured nail. You know, she'd said, looking up at him as he materialized in a swirl of irritated shadow, this is a fantastic collection, but the maintenance must be a nightmare. All this polishing. Do you have staff for that, or is it more of a magically enchanted self-polishing armor situation? They are imbued with the spirits of the vanquished warriors who once wore them, he had informed her, his tone dripping with dark significance. So, ghosts do the polishing? That's clever. Good delegation. He'd simply vanished, because it was less effort than trying to explain the concept of eternal spectral torment to a woman who saw it as an efficient housekeeping solution. Her promised exploration of his library became her primary occupation. Alistair would find himself drawn there, standing in the high, shadowed archway of the door, watching her. She would be curled in one of the enormous wingback chairs, a stack of books on the table beside her, a look of intense concentration on her face. She would chew on the end of a pen she'd somehow produced, where did she get a pen, and mutter to herself. He tried to maintain his captor persona. He would stride into the library, his presence intended to be a chilling reminder of her status. You seem comfortable, he would say, his voice a low rumble. I am, she'd reply without looking up from her book. This chair has excellent lumbar support. You wouldn't think so, looking at it, but it's surprisingly ergonomic. Did you know that the 12th century interpretation of the Gnostic Gospels was heavily influenced by a mistranslation of a single Aramaic phrase? Fascinating stuff. He had no response to that. He had read those Gospels. He had, in fact, had a rather heated argument with the author of one of them. But he couldn't very well say that. It would ruin the mystique. Instead, he would just stand there, feeling strangely like an intruder in his own library. One evening, he found her not with a book, but with a laptop perched on her knees. The Wi-Fi password. He had come to regret giving it to her. "What foul modern sorcery is this?" he asked, gesturing at the glowing screen. "I'm unsubscribing from bridal magazines," she said, clicking away with brisk determination. Modern bride, the not perfect wedding. It's surprisingly cathartic. Click. You no longer have to care about the pros and cons of a destination wedding. Click. The debate over peonies versus hydrangeas is irrelevant to your life. Click. You are free from the tyranny of the seating chart. Alistair watched the screen. He saw images of smiling couples, of elaborate cakes, of dresses so white they hurt his sensitive eyes. It was a world so alien to his own, yet her description of it as a prison resonated more and more. He had always seen his immortality as a form of power. But it was also a cage. He was bound by his own nature, by the endless, grinding weight of his own history. He could not change. He could not die. He could only endure. "You truly did not wish for this life," he said. It was not a question. She finally looked up from the laptop, her face illuminated by its pale light. "Does anyone ever truly wish for the life they're given? You're an immortal vampire king. Was that on your vision board when you were a kid?" The question was so unexpected, so absurd, that a short, sharp laugh escaped him. It was a rusty sound, unused. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed. It felt strange. "I was not a kid," he said, recovering himself. "And we did not have vision boards. We had feudal obligations and the constant threat of plague." "So, you're saying it wasn't on the vision board?" she shot back, a ghost of a smile on her lips. "See? We're not so different. Just two people trapped in careers we didn't exactly apply for." That, he thought, was the most ridiculous and yet most accurate thing anyone had ever said to him. The sheer audacity of her comparing her society wedding to his eternal, blood-soaked reign was breathtaking. And yet, he found himself sitting in the wingback chair opposite hers. The act felt momentous, a crossing of some invisible line. He was no longer the captor looming over his prisoner. He was a man, sitting in a room with a woman. "Tell me," he said, the word emerging more softly than he intended. "About this thesis." And she did. For the next hour, she spoke about the Codex Umbra, about the evolution of heretical thought, about the way history is shaped by the powerful and rewritten by the victors. She spoke with a passion and intelligence that he had not encountered in centuries. The mortals he usually interacted with were either terrified, sycophantic, or begging for their lives. None of them had ever lectured him on 12th century textual analysis. He found himself listening. Truly listening. He interjected, correcting a date here, offering an alternate interpretation there, based on first-hand knowledge he disguised as obscure academic theory. Her eyes would light up when he did, a spark of intellectual camaraderie passing between them. "You know a lot about this," she said, her gaze sharp and curious. "I have had a great deal of time to read," he deflected smoothly. The conversation drifted. From history to art. From art to music. He learned that she loved the raw energy of punk rock, a fact that was as incongruous and delightful as everything else about her. He, in turn, admitted a grudging respect for the mathematical precision of Bach. "Of course you do," she teased. "It's orderly. It's complex. It's probably great for brooding too." He did not deny it. It was in the middle of this strange, unprecedented evening that he realized he was not thinking about Hugo at all. The entire purpose of this grand endeavor, to torment his rival, had faded into the background. It seemed petty now. Immature. His focus had shifted entirely to the woman in front of him, to the quickness of her mind and the surprising vulnerability hidden beneath her layers of wit. He was enjoying himself. The realization was as shocking as a stake to the heart. The evening was interrupted by the arrival of one of his wraith servants, a silent, shimmering figure that phased through the wall with a tray. On the tray were 2 glasses and a bottle of wine. A deep, dark red. One of the finest from his cellars, a vintage from a vineyard that had turned to dust 500 years ago. He hadn't summoned it. Clara looked at the wraith, then at the wine, then at him. "Did you order that?" "No," Alistair said, his eyes narrowed. His servants were extensions of his will. They did not take initiative. Unless they had sensed a change in his own desires that he himself had not fully acknowledged. The thought was deeply unsettling. The wraith poured 2 glasses and faded back into the wall. An expectant silence hung in the air. "Well," Clara said, raising an eyebrow. "It would be rude not to." She picked up a glass. "To unconventional vacations?" Alistair looked at her, at the way the firelight danced in her hair and the genuine amusement in her eyes. He picked up his own glass. The wine was, of course, exquisite. But it was the company that was the true luxury. "To lumber support," he offered, the corner of his mouth twitching upwards. Her laugh rang out in the ancient library, bright and clear and utterly out of place. And Alistair found himself smiling. Not a smirk. Not a predator's grin. A genuine, unfamiliar, and deeply alarming smile. He was in far more trouble than he had ever imagined. The transition from baffled captor to something else was subtle. It wasn't a single moment, but a collection of them, like stones accumulating to shift the course of a river. Alistair found his routines, once as fixed as constellations, bending around Clara's presence. He started joining her for meals. Not because he needed to eat, but because the cavernous dining hall felt less like a monument to his own solitude when she was sitting at the other end of the ridiculously long table, making wry comments about the ancestral portraits. "That one," she said one evening, pointing her fork at a stern-faced man with a truly unfortunate ruff. "He looks like he just smelled something bad." "Was that a family trait?" "That is my great-great-grandsire, Vladislav the Impaler," Alistair said, with a hint of pride. "He was known for his severity." "Severity? He looks like he's about to send his soup back because it has a fly in it. A very, very tiny fly that only he can see." She took a sip of water. "I bet he was a nightmare at dinner parties." Alistair had been at dinner parties with Vladislav. She was not wrong. He began to anticipate her commentary, to look forward to the way her mind worked. She saw the world with a clarity that was both refreshing and unnerving. She punctured his grandiosity not with malice, but with a kind of cheerful, practical logic that was impossible to argue with. He took her for a walk in the moon garden. It was one of the jewels of his castle, a place of silent, spectral beauty. Ghost lilies bloomed with pale, internal light, and the air was thick with the scent of night phlox, a flower that only opened for the moon. It was a place he had designed to evoke awe and a sense of otherworldly sorrow. "It's beautiful," Clara said, her voice soft. "But you know what it needs? A bench. A nice, comfortable bench. My feet are killing me in these shoes." She was wearing a pair of velvet slippers she'd found. Apparently, even his magically provisioned footwear was not up to her standards. He had conjured a bench. A simple, elegant thing of carved obsidian. He hadn't even thought about it. The desire for her to be comfortable had simply translated into action. He sat beside her, the cold stone a stark contrast to the strange warmth spreading through his chest. They sat in silence for a while, a comfortable quiet that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "You must get lonely," she said, not looking at him, but out at the glowing flowers. The statement was so direct, so devoid of artifice, that it took him by surprise. "I am a king. I am never alone." "That's not what I mean," she said. "You're surrounded by servants who can't speak and portraits of grumpy relatives. You have all this." She gestured to the castle, the garden, the sky, "but who do you talk to? Who challenges you? Who tells you your rough is ridiculous?" He had no answer. Because the answer was no one. Not for centuries. Not until her. The lords of his court were sycophants. His enemies were predictable. His existence had been a long, monotonous echo chamber. She was the first new sound in 1,000 years. "My reputation precedes me," he said, the words a poor defense. "Your reputation is a cage," she countered gently. "You're trapped in it, just like I was trapped in my engagement. Everyone expects you to be the dark, terrifying monster, so you play the part. It must be exhausting." He turned to look at her then. Her face was sincere, her eyes full of a startling empathy. She wasn't mocking him. She was seeing him. It was the most terrifying thing that had happened to him all week. More terrifying than her request for granola. More terrifying than her critique of his armory. "You assume much," he said, his voice rough. "I'm a good observer," she replied. "I had to be. In my world, you learn to read the subtext. You learn to see what people aren't saying. And you," she poked his arm lightly, a gesture of shocking familiarity, "are screaming I am a deeply intellectual and terminally bored man who just wants someone to discuss 12th century heretics with." He should have been furious. He should have risen in a tempest of rage at her presumption. But he couldn't. Because she was right. So profoundly, absurdly right. "That is a gross oversimplification," he managed, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "Is it?" she challenged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Okay, fine. And maybe you also want to show off your very impressive collection of soul-destroying ancient texts. Your ego is a part of it, I'll grant you that." This was their language. This blend of sarcasm and sincerity. A joke that held a core of truth. A sarcastic comment that was actually a seed of deep, genuine vulnerability. He was beginning to realize that her flippancy wasn't a shield against him, it was a shield against the world. A world that had tried to sand her down into something smooth, and predictable, and beige. He felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness. It was an alien emotion. He had protected his territory, his power, his secrets. He had never felt the urge to protect a person. Not like this. The thought of her returning to her life of beige upholstery and synergistic mergers was intolerable. "The wedding," he said, the word tasting foul. "You called it a transaction. Was there no affection for him at all?" Clara sighed, her playful demeanor slipping away, replaced by a familiar weariness. "Hugo isn't a bad person. He's just an empty one. Our relationship is like a business partnership. We have aligned interests. We look good together on paper." Affection wasn't really part of the negotiation. She hugged her arms around herself. "I think I tried, at the beginning, to find something. But it was like trying to find a spark in wet sand. Eventually, you just get tired of trying. Then why agree to it? Family," she said simply. "Duty. The path of least resistance. Sometimes it's just easier to let the current carry you than to try and swim against it. You end up exhausted and you drown anyway." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "And then you get kidnapped by a vampire king and realize that maybe drowning would have been the more interesting option." The joke was there, but it didn't land with its usual lightness. It was heavy with unspoken sadness. It was a throwaway line that revealed a deep, genuine despair. He saw it for what it was, a cry for help, disguised as a punchline. He didn't know what to say. The usual platitudes of comfort were foreign to him. So he did the only thing he could think of. He reached out, his movements slow, and gently took her hand. His skin was cold, hers was warm. The contact sent a jolt through him, a current of life that was both startling and addictive. She didn't pull away. She laced her fingers with his. "Your hands are freezing," she murmured. "I am dead," he reminded her. "Right," she said, a faint smile returning to her face. "Forgot about that part." They sat there, on the obsidian bench in the garden of glowing lilies, holding hands like teenagers. The fearsome Night King and his sarcastic, willing prisoner. And for the first time, Alistair didn't feel like a king, or a captor, or a monster. He felt like a man who had just found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. He was beginning to suspect that in his attempt to steal Hugo's most valuable asset, he had accidentally stolen something that was becoming invaluable to himself. And the thought of ever giving her back was a prospect more horrifying than an eternity of solitude. The crisis, when it came, did not arrive with a clash of steel or a siege upon his gates. Alistair had, in a moment of what he now recognized as romantic foolishness, almost hoped it would. He imagined himself, a dark avenging angel, defending his castle, defending her from Hugo's mundane forces. It would have been dramatic. It would have been satisfying. Instead, the crisis arrived in the form of an email. Clara was in the library, of course, cross-referencing a 14th-century demonology text with an online academic journal. Alistair was nearby, pretending to read a tome on ancient battle strategies but actually just watching the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. The domesticity of it was still a shock to his system, but a pleasant one, like a warm drink on a cold night. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, her fingers flying across her laptop's trackpad. "Have you discovered another mistranslation?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Worse," she said, her tone flat and dead. "I have an email from Hugo." Alistair was instantly on his feet, his chair scraping back harshly against the stone floor. The pleasant warmth vanished, replaced by a familiar, icy rage. Hugo. The name itself was an irritant, a piece of grit in the machinery of his newfound contentment. "He has located you?" Alistair demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Not exactly," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "He's not writing to me. He's CC'd me on an email to his legal department," she read aloud, her voice a monotone that belied the fury he could see simmering in her tense shoulders. Subject: unlawful seizure of asset and breach of premarital contract. "Gentlemen, as discussed, please find attached the preliminary draft of our injunction against Alistair von Krolock, resident of." She trailed off, looking up at him. "He doesn't have your address." "That's a problem for him, resident of an undetermined spooky castle in the Carpathians. We will be seeking damages for emotional distress, breach of contract, and the recovery of the primary asset integral to the Vance Criswell merger, i.e., Clara Abernathy. Please expedite. We are on a timeline." She stopped reading. The silence in the library was absolute. Alistair stared at her. Asset. Primary asset. i.e., Clara Abernathy. He had seen declarations of war more passionate than this. He had seen grocery lists written with more feeling. Hugo wasn't trying to rescue the woman he loved. He was trying to repossess a piece of corporate property that had gone missing. "He does not," Alistair said slowly, the words like chips of ice, "ask if you are safe." "Nope," Clara said, her voice brittle. She snapped the laptop shut with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "No, hope you're okay. No, are you being held against your will? Just unlawful seizure of asset. It's nice to know my primary value is as a line item." He saw it then. The deep, profound hurt she had hidden for so long behind her wall of wit. The jokes about being an asset, the sarcastic comments about the merger, they had been her armor. But this cold, clinical email had pierced straight through it. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. The spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, aching resignation. It was the look of a person who had expected the worst and had just had it confirmed in writing. And Alistair felt something snap. It was not the cold, calculated anger of a king whose territory had been challenged. It was a hot, white-hot fury. A deeply personal rage on behalf of someone else. He wanted to tear Hugo Vance apart. Not for his arrogance, not for his trespasses, but for this. For the casual cruelty that had extinguished the light in her eyes. In that moment, watching the pain etch itself onto her face, the last piece of his own ancient, frozen heart cracked open. The grudging respect, the amusement, the fascination, the protective fondness, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying, undeniable truth. He was in love with her. The realization didn't feel poetic. It felt like a punch to the gut. It was inconvenient, illogical, and utterly overwhelming. He, Alistair, who had viewed love as a mortal folly, a weakness to be exploited, was ensnared by it. And he didn't care. All he cared about was erasing the hurt from her face. Before he could speak, before he could formulate a plan to rain down 1,000 years of darkness upon Hugo Vance and his entire legal department, a shimmering portal, utterly unlike his own shadowy methods, tore open in the middle of the library. It was a sterile, blue-white light, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive cologne. From it stepped Hugo Vance. He was exactly as Alistair had pictured him from the society pages, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than a small car, his hair perfectly coiffed, a look of intense annoyance on his handsome, vapid face. He was flanked by two men in identical suits, carrying briefcases. Lawyers. Not an army. Not even a single, solitary bodyguard. He had brought lawyers to a vampire's castle. Clara had been right. It was so much worse than he could have imagined. There you are, Hugo said, his gaze sweeping over Clara with the proprietary air of a man checking on his parked car. He then looked around the library, his expression a mixture of disdain and impatience. Good God, what a dump. Is that actual cobwebs? He completely ignored Alistair, as if the 7-foot-tall, ancient vampire lord radiating palpable menace was nothing more than a piece of Gothic furniture. Clara, let's go, Hugo commanded, not asked. You have caused an incredible amount of trouble. We've had to push back the quarterly report, and my mother is having palpitations about the catering deposit. Clara stood frozen, her face a mask of stone. We have the paperwork, Hugo continued, snapping his fingers at one of the lawyers, who immediately opened his briefcase. An injunction. A cease and desist. And a motion for damages. We're prepared to settle this out of court, assuming you, he finally deigned to look at Alistair, his eyes flicking over him dismissively, release my fiancée immediately and agree to cover all associated legal fees. He never once looked at Clara and asked if she was all right. He never once asked what had happened. His only concern was the disruption to his schedule and his finances. Alistair watched Clara. He saw her jaw tighten. He saw her take a small, sharp breath. He saw the last vestiges of hope die in her eyes, the final confirmation that to this man, she was not a person. She was a problem to be solved. And Alistair knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, placing himself between Hugo and Clara. He was taller than Hugo by a good foot, and he let the full weight of his age and power settle into his posture. The temperature in the room plummeted. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and writhe. She will not be going with you, Alistair said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable finality of a closing tomb. Hugo actually scoffed. A small, arrogant puff of air. Don't be ridiculous. She's my fiancée. There's a contract. A legally binding 1 inch. Your contracts do not apply in my kingdom, Alistair said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. And your fiancée, it seems, has developed some new opinions during her stay. He turned his head slightly to look back at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. He saw a flicker of something return to her gaze. A spark of her old fire. He turned back to Hugo. For instance, she finds your meticulously planned 5-year tax avoidance strategy to be, and I believe I'm quoting her correctly, pedestrian. Clara let out a choked sound that was halfway between a sob and a laugh. Hugo's jaw dropped. What? How do you? That's proprietary information. She also mentioned your habit of alphabetizing your socks, Alistair continued, enjoying himself immensely now. She finds it indicative of a small and terrified mind. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Hugo's face was turning a fascinating shade of mottled red. This is absurd. Clara, tell this relic to stand down. We have a brunch tasting on Saturday. This was the moment. The choice. Alistair held his breath. Clara took a step forward, moving to stand beside Alistair. Not behind him, but beside him. She looked Hugo directly in the eye, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, stripped of all sarcasm, all irony. It was pure, unadulterated truth. No, she said. It was just one word, but it was a revolution. No. Hugo spluttered. What do you mean, no? The merger, the families. The merger can find another linchpin, Clara said, her chin high. And the families can be disappointed. I am not an asset, Hugo. I am not a clause in your contract. I am a person. And I'm done. Alistair felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He looked at Hugo and his 2 useless lawyers. He could have destroyed them. He could have unmade them with a thought. But that was the old Alistair. The new Alistair, the one who was in love with a brilliant, sarcastic woman who liked punk rock, had a better idea. I'm sorry, he said, his voice laced with a magnanimous, kingly pity. She's staying. It seems she prefers my library to your portfolio. He gave Hugo a dismissive wave. Your portal is still open. I suggest you use it. Goodbye. Hugo stood there, utterly defeated, not by dark magic, but by a simple, unequivocal no. He looked from Clara's resolute face to Alistair's mocking smile and seemed to shrink. He turned, wordlessly, and stalked back through the shimmering portal, his lawyers scrambling after him like well-dressed rats. The portal snapped shut, plunging the library back into its familiar, gothic gloom. The fire in the hearth roared back to life. Silence. Alistair and Clara stood side by side in the vast, ancient room. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, leaving behind something quiet and fragile and real. He turned to her. He didn't know the right words. He had a millennium of speeches and pronouncements at his disposal, but none of them fit this moment. All his grandeur, all his power, felt inadequate. So he did the only thing he could. He offered her his hand. Not as a king to a subject, or a captor to a prisoner, but as a man to a woman. An invitation. A question. Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. He let her see everything he was feeling. The fear, the hope, the raw, terrifying sincerity of his newfound love. He hid nothing. For the first time, he was completely, utterly vulnerable. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. The real smile. The one that lit up her entire being. "Well," she said, her voice soft. "It would be rude not to." She took his hand. Her fingers laced through his. Warmth against cold. Life against death. It felt like coming home. "Just so we're clear," she said, her eyes sparkling with their old, familiar wit, "this doesn't mean I'm going to start approving your canapé menus." Alistair threw back his head and laughed. A real, deep, joyful sound that echoed off the ancient books. He was Alistair, the Night King, and he had just been well and truly conquered. And he had never, in his entire, long existence, felt so gloriously, wonderfully free.